Great deserts of the land, found everywhere at different latitudes. A unique environment. But is it possible there was a unique life form in this unique environment at one point in time? When we explore it, we see unique structures, and perhaps they're just simply natural structures that have artificially looking features to them. Yet if you go around the desert enough, you can be excused for understanding that there may have been a very different form of life there. Our official mainstream and scientific accounts tell us that evolution is the explanation for different life. But what if there's an entirely different account, a oral tradition that relates a different sort of cycle that we've looked at? In this exploration, we're going to examine the account of the Hopi, their 5 ages, and most specifically, the very unique account of the saviors of their particular culture, their society, the ant people. We have found many examples that indicate that there was some sort of hive civilization that may have existed. Now, whether this civilization was subterranean or existed on the surface, and the details that we still find in the Hopi culture that may refer to it, the very dramatic landscapes of the desert that give rise to the possibility of different civilizations and a very different form of life, a completely different account of our origins and what we may have endured in the past. Come join me as we explore the account of the legend of the ant people. The Hopi, a Native American tribe, at least according to our official definitions. I'm always interested by the fact that we have this tendency of broadly categorizing peoples in this day and age. For example, we refer to Native Americans or indigenous people as the original inhabitants of all of North America, and depending what nation you're in, you'll have different broad categorizations. And yet each of these peoples represent unique tribes, unique nations with different societies and unique customs. The Hopi are one of many. And yet one of their main accounts of having 5 ages or 5 eras has no doubt inspired the theory of 5 eras on this channel. I wanted to look at the Hopi tradition and their oral traditions of the concept of the ant people. This legacy of, in the past, their entire civilization being destroyed, one time by fire and another time by ice. And the ant people were a group of people who helped the Hopi survive both of these horrific calamities, at least according to the oral tradition. Now, I am not going to try to relay the exact details of the Hopi oral tradition, because I did not grow up in that society. But we are going to look at it objectively and try to find a way in which it fits into the concept of our 5 eras, and even look at some different theories for what the ant people really were. The Hopi are very intriguing in the fact that within their cultural traditions, they do show different varieties that indicate something that is, well, just unbelievably amazing in terms of its variety and creativity, if we are to believe that these are simple cultural traditions that were not inspired. And yet we have the feeling when we look at the images and we study these cultural traditions of the Hopi that they do seem to be quite, frankly, divinely inspired. That there really was a situation in which these people faced imminent destruction. And we look at the other remnants across the land, and the Hopi existed, officially, for thousands of years in northern Arizona. Now it's possible that their people have been there for far longer. What I've always found intriguing about our official mainstream explanation for the people that came to North America, crossing the land bridge in the Bering Strait, is that they all did develop their unique languages and unique customs. Now, I suppose on a long enough timeline, perhaps we could accept that explanation, but I always had an interesting difficulty with it, because oddly enough, it's the exact same story that we have over in Europe. We're to believe that Europeans are one large culture, one large group, and yet when we look between the lines, we find many differences. You can find no shortage of references and artwork that depict these ant people. Who were they and what were they? The official tradition of the Hopi simply says that they were a special race that resided in subterranean areas and that they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these calamities. Or perhaps, as we compare it to our reset theories on the channel and looking at the previous 5 eras, that the ant people were benefactors of the Hopi. Were they divine benefactors, or were they a special and unique race of beings that happened to be existing in either different parts of the land or perhaps even different areas of land that are difficult to access? And that for whatever reason they provided aid to the Hopi to allow them to survive these terrifying calamities. The details that we find within these legends are very compelling and very intriguing. There's also the fact that there is the ongoing presence of the ant people that is practiced and still remembered to this day, from both the Hopi and then their oral traditions going beyond their own society. The really interesting thing is that when you look at the Southwest Desert in the United States, you do get that impression that the land has been subjected to terrifying forces in the past. Now, once again, mainstream science has explanations for why we have different environments, different climate zones in different areas of land, and that there's unique weather factors that may have contributed to this. And these may all be true, and yet when you see some of the dramatic and unique existences that still linger in the desert to this day, the Southwest Desert in the United States is very intriguing. The fact that it is such an arid and yet almost lifeless environment from some perspectives, and yet life very much did flourish. There's even the signs that there are other sorts of life that still continue to flourish and may have once prospered in the desert in the past. We always think of that example of the burro or the donkey, the creature that was brought in by miners during the 1800s and was simply left to die, and yet left to its own devices, the donkey or the burro flourished. So is it a similar tale then with the Hopi or other peoples that may have just simply been left on the land? Or trying to figure out exactly what the origin and the true identity of these ant people really are? Was there some grander plan? Why is it that we have all these different legacies and legends that still endure to this day? It's not just with the Hopi, though. Many different cultures and many societies have these traditions, these myths, these legends about how they came to be. And yet it's interesting to think that there are a lot of overlapping themes within them. There's the concept of some being, whether it's divine or otherwise, having a greater capability, and utilizing that greater capability to help the people that still exist to this day that needed to survive these calamities in the past. And I would argue that this is some of the evidence that we have that these calamities did indeed occur. It was not a one-time event, but there's evidence that these terrifying reset events occurred on multiple occasions. And the legacy of the Hopi and their oral tradition of fire and ice. At one point in time, the land was beset with fire, and another point in time, it was beset with ice. They even tell us that the reason that ants are so thin is because the ants actually provided their own sustenance to sustain the people. Now, that's a very benevolent perception of these ant people. But what were they really? And why is it that we have the Hopi who show this divine adherence to remembering what the ant people really provided them? I've always been amazed by the Kachina dolls itself. The Kachina dolls themselves that seem to represent something that goes beyond a divine or even a more advanced being. It's almost as though it seems to be an amalgamation of a spiritual and yet a more advanced technological sophistication that was once possessed by these beings that of course we would think of as gods or other divine beings. But what were they really? And there's always that hard question of, were these saviors or were these tormentors? Because if this was some sort of separate species or separate race, referring to the ant people, what was their true intention? Did they only want to help the Hopi? Or were there other groups of human beings that had to go through these reset periods? Were they simply left to their own devices and ultimately left to die? Or were they abandoned, much in the same way that the donkey was officially abandoned in the Southwest American desert during the mining activities? What do these Kachina dolls really represent, though, on a deeper level? Is it just simply a spiritual reference, or are they really showing the technological capacity that these beings really had? There's other strange rumors that endure to this day of what's really happening in the Southwest Desert. Now, it may simply be the fact that this is a very extreme environment. you have very low moisture in the desert, and certain areas of the high desert, such as the Mojave, which is adjacent to northern Arizona, you see rather unique environmental effects that occur. Was the land always this way, or is it simply the lingering effects of terrific forces that the lands were subjected to in the past? And that's why we have these legacies and these legends that endure to this day. I'm also fascinated by the fact that, once again, we have people that did not witness these events and did not participate in them, claiming that they know better in terms of what happened, as opposed to the people who actually have an oral tradition. There's a very intriguing connection, and it goes beyond a surface connection when you compare the origin accounts of both the Hopi and the Sumerians and the subsequent Babylonians. The concept of how the sky god actually compares from Babylonian and Sumerian myth to the concept of the ant people. Is it possible that these are actually referring to the same beings? Were they really deities, or were they actually some sort of advanced culture? And perhaps an even more disturbing consideration, that these cultures could have been species that actually survived previous resets, and they had greater knowledge. We even see areas in the terrain, such as Cappadocia, Turkey, which we've explored in detail, where it appears as though a civilization or structures have been built on top of the remnants of previous structures. Now, once again, our mainstream science assures us that this is all natural terrain that just happens to have the appearance of artificial structures that have structures built on top of it, and because of the unique conditions provided by the climate, that these natural structures were malleable and could easily be formed into modern houses, dwellings, and cathedrals, and even, of course, our favorite castles. That's the official explanation we get for Cappadocia. But could you look at it from another perspective? Do you see something different when you look at this? Does this resemble some sort of hive-like environment? A physical hive-like environment? Perhaps some sort of subterranean civilization that had lived and existed underground, that eventually made its way back to the surface over a long enough period of time. Why were they down there for so long? Did they have to survive the terrible calamity of fire from the sky, or an ice environment? Even the various cultural representations of the Hopi seem to refer to this pattern, and you'll see this representation of these ant people appearing in many different places. It's almost more prevalent than you tend to see certain icons in other religions, and that's something else I've found rather fascinating. And it would be very interesting to listen to the full oral traditions that we have. And of course, there are nuances, there are varieties of these oral traditions. One thing I consider, though, is it possible that these ant people were not just the benign benefactors that we have an account of? Could it also be possible that they were operating with a completely different form of intent? Were human beings, or the human beings that we know to this day, the natural human beings, or have they been altered over time? Or could they be referencing the offshoots of these original species? It's hard to say. Looking at some of the diagrams that we have, though, of extensive underground caverns and maps and existences that we know to be real, then we have to ask these hard questions, that if there was a subterranean civilization, and indeed there are many indications that there was, and there's still evidence that there were subterranean civilizations, then how were these subterranean constructions achieved? Once again, we'll be informed that it's because we had a lot of will and just time on our hands in the distant past, and we were willing to take the painstaking effort to carve out these vast caverns, these incredible labyrinths that are subterranean. But does that really make sense? Would one actually go to all this effort, even if the soil or the material that they were carving through was more prone to being carved through? It still takes a lot of effort, and effort during a time when we're informed that there were logistical limitations. Of course, logistical limitations are never taken into account, it seems, when we're considering some of these mainstream accounts that we have of the past. But I look at some of these representations of these divine beings, and the other question that comes into my mind is, if they're not necessarily representing divine beings, then what are they representing? Could these ant people and these other references and terms that we have for these divine beings, and it seems as though every society and culture, whether it's an ancient civilization or even the more modern civilizations, have different references to these divine beings. They seem to represent perhaps an heightened technological capability. Perhaps they did have greater technology that may have seemed divine to those that existed at the time and actually kept the record of what really happened. What truly transpired during the time of these great calamities or these catastrophes, these accounts that we have of floods or fire from the sky, or even the land being covered in ice. And that's where I've always found a lot of interest, because if you step far enough back, you do actually find a lot more overlap within both the mainstream perspective of what happened in the past and even the alternative research perspective of what happened in the past. You can actually find connections between references of glaciers going over the land and, of course, this concept of the land being frozen at particular points in time. But you have to ask, is that where we lost the detail? Or do we still have the detail? It's just been mixed and confused in a series of overlapping accounts, and therefore we can never get the idea of what truly transpired. I look at the representations that we have of Sumeria and Babylon, and it strikes me with all the similarities that we have, especially with societies and civilizations that existed in completely different parts of the land and were isolated from one another, at least officially. Yet these stories that we look at in these details, when we examine them in totality, seem to give us much more connection than we'd ever expect to find. When you see the numerous cave drawings or the incredible artwork and then even the costumes and the divine reference that the Hopi have for the ant people, you get the impression that perhaps there was something more to the existence of these beings, that there is this sort of detail that's captured and remembered to this day, and not just in the oral traditions, but also in the cultural traditions. And really think about this when we have people that are dressing up or showing reverence for other beings or other creatures. Think about the fact that while it may seem far-fetched in some extraordinary account, or of course we always want to refer to the alien concept that we have, and it's not to discredit that, but it's merely to look at things from an objective point of view. Possible that there were, and maybe still are somewhere, beings that look like this. And would this explain a lot of these strange encounters that we've had over time? Whether these are actual strange encounters that are referenced in official history, or are they simply anecdotes that have been taken too far with certain details ascribed to them? You can go to this day and still explore all these vast subterranean compounds, whether you go to Turkey and many other areas across the land, where you can find extensive cave systems that you wouldn't expect to find them. I'll reference one example in the United States, Kentucky, where they have incredibly large cave systems that many happen to be overlooked, of course, aside from the main tourist areas that we have, which seem to be the areas that we're supposed to pay attention to. But when we're paying attention to those areas, we often forget how all-encompassing, how omnipresent these subterranean systems really are. And it does lend credence to the original theory or the oral tradition that there was the existence of a civilization that was underground. Now the question endures, was this just simply our predecessors? Or were our predecessors simply allowed to survive in these areas? Or, from a more negative perspective, were they taken down there to be altered, to be changed, and perhaps even to be experimented on in ways that defy our imagination? Because while you have more advanced technology, and we discussed in our explorations this past week, technology is a two-edged sword. It can be used for good purposes, it can be used for evil purposes, and it can be used for everything in between. The ambiguity of having these incredible cave and subterranean systems that exist to this day being an example. Now, perhaps you're more comfortable believing that it was merely a group of our predecessors who simply had a lot of time on their hands or were seeking to survive whatever terrifying empire was hunting them down, and rather than flee to more easy areas to hide in, they decided to carve themselves caves in areas because they had no other options. And that may be possible, but there are so many details behind that account that I always found unlikely. I'm also interested in the fact that these 5 ages that the Hopi really seem to understand and be aware of do show an equivalence that we find in other societies and other traditions. These cultures showing these divine beings or other forms of life. And that's the next question that we have to ask. Are these ant people, are these Anunnaki, are these Tuatha Danann, and all the different names that we have for these divine beings, are they really in fact divine beings? Or are they other forms of life? Is it even possible that they're species that existed in earlier eras that did manage to find a way to survive the reset? Now, that begs the question, well, if there were other beings that survived the reset, other great civilizations, then where are they today? There may be an explanation in the fact that there are physical realms or physical capacities of existence that are beyond our ability to access. To this day, we still have a very large debate about what the exact shape of the land is, and once again, while we're assured that we know exactly what the shape of the land is, and we have a lot of evidence that is incontrovertible according to many, the fact remains is that it is still debated. There's also accounts that the shape of the land did change. Now, the shape of the land changing, is that a mainstream account? Yes, indeed it is, because we do have the theory, or if you want to consider it a fact depending on your perspective, the existence of all the continents being together as Pangea. And when you look at the unique details that we have captured of the Hopi engaging in their cultural traditions, we do see something rather extraordinary. Almost a completely different way of life that has somehow been preserved over time. Now, is this something that the Hopi had as their original traditions, or was this something that they learned from their divine benefactors? Were they chosen by the ant people to survive? Or was it just all simply part of a larger experiment? The ant people were not the divine benefactors. They were actually more of a malign, intented being that wanted to see what would happen if they aided certain groups of people and did not aid certain groups of people. We don't know for sure, and that's why we have to consider all accounts. And is it even possible that this idea of creatures or a species resembling ants might be far-fetched and may simply be an interpretation? That's also entirely possible as well. Is it possible that the ant people that are remembered by the Hopi were simply other human beings that were wearing some sort of form of an apparatus, or dare I say, an environmental suit, a space suit, and that's really what the Hopi remembered and that's what they captured in their tradition? That's possible as well. And you can find numerous examples of this if you go back and you watch an old TV series called Space 1999, and I'll reference an episode called The Mission of the Darians. You'll see that the Darians actually managed to cause people to believe that they were some sort of divine being simply by wearing an environmental suit. Because if you had people that had never seen these things before, then what would they make of them? And whether we're considering the Hopi traditions or the traditions and the myths that we have from Sumeria or Babylon or countless others, we do have to ask that question. Are they really representing divine beings? Or are they simply representing humans that had more advanced technological capabilities? And maybe what we might think of as more advanced humans. Of course, there's another disturbing question that we have to consider. Is it possible that in addition to having advanced technological capabilities, that these humans were advanced in other ways that we don't like to consider? Ways that we're told not to consider today, such as introspection, the, how shall we say, strengthening of their own spirit, the connection that they had between their physical and spiritual form. Now, many will argue that science has disproven this, and yet there are many areas that science doesn't have an answer for. They have theories, but we always have to define the difference between a theory and a fact. And when you look at the remnants of these incredible subterranean compounds, and we think of the subterranean compounds that we have, that we know, or at least believe, that our own civilization has constructed, there does seem to be this recurring mentality, this idea that the only way to survive catastrophic events, whether it was past, present, or future, is by constructing these subterranean compounds. What is the real origin of this elaborate and dramatic terrain that we see in the southwestern United States? Very, very prominently in areas that seem to be very controlled. And maybe there's a good reason why these areas are controlled. Maybe it is simply to preserve their natural aesthetic appearance and to make sure that it endures for future generations. There's no doubt that's what will be informed, but could there be other explanations behind it? Is this just natural terrain that we're looking at, and it was formed by natural forces over time? Or is there perhaps another explanation? The very formation of the land. I'm always interested too when you look at some of the adobe huts and the different constructions, and you see a wide variety of capability with the Hopi alone. Now keep in mind, when we consider the Hopi, we're only examining one tribe, one nation. There are many tribes, many nations, with many different traditions. Yet for some unknown reason, we have this overlapping within their origin. And yet even in different civilizations that were located across oceans, which shouldn't have had any sort of contact. And yet we seem to have different explanations that try to account for this discrepancy that we have. Why is it that we say that the Egyptians have presence all across the land if they were indeed confined to geographical areas, or the Babylonians, or the Sumerians? All these accounts we have of these sea people who just showed up and caused an apocalypse, but we really don't know a lot about them. Well, we could say that we don't really know a lot about what transpired 150 years ago because we don't have any first-hand sources to consult with. We have a very well-documented recorded history, and we're very confident in that. Because in the United States especially, our history from the 1800s was recorded by journalists. And if we trust journalists and the historians that interpreted what the journalists recorded after the fact, then we know we have a very confident view of our history. But going back in the distant past, do we have that same confidence? Or are we really left to the devices of hypothesis and speculation? And of course, that's why people set out to deride those that engage in hypothesis and speculation, even though mainstream science says that evolution is a theory, although some will present it as a fact, and those words exactly were used. Now, ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide what to believe, because that is supposed to be a freedom that you're entitled to wherever you are in the land, whatever your particular nation or your government is to this day. You're at least supposed to be able to decide what you really believe. But what did the Hopi really believe? Did they really believe that there were these creatures, these divine beings from their perspective that resembled ants? These divine beings that sustained them through difficult catastrophes on multiple occasions? Catastrophes that completely changed the land. The accounts say that these Hopi were taken to subterranean compounds, and there they were enabled to survive the catastrophes that were afflicting the land. They were also provided with sustenance. And then there's other accounts that these ant people went so far as to sacrifice to ensure that the Hopi survived. We're not really sure exactly what happened. And it could be that the ant people aren't any sort of different creature, that they were merely other types of human beings, or other human beings that had more advanced technological capabilities, and that the devices, the technology that they used, was the only appearance that the Hopi or their progenitors actually witnessed. And as a result of that, it worked its way into their oral tradition and their legends, and really what they have are human beings that were wearing environmental suits at all points in time when they witnessed them. And as a result of that, they perceived them as a completely different creature. And you will find numerous examples of that, whether you look in science fiction, fiction, or other sources that show that the concept of people's identity and their culture and what they witness and what they capture is very malleable. Look no further than all of the unique societal developments that occurred after World War II, with the sudden presence of Allied soldiers in isolated islands across the Pacific. And look at the cultural effects there. Now step far enough back and consider how these things could be perceived over a long period of time, with oral traditions being passed down. How long were these oral traditions passed down for? Are we talking periods of thousands of years? Or are we talking an even greater timeline? Or even more disturbingly, are we talking a much more shortened timeline? Because I think one of the difficulties that we have is just how quickly things can change. Just think about this. If you completely remove an entire generation, just one single generation, one 20-year period, one entire group of people that passes down all the knowledge, all the understanding to the next generation, then in a 20-year time frame, would it be possible to induce an entirely new societal identity, an entirely new culture on a people? How long would it really take? Because I believe we have numerous examples that that time frame is on a much shorter period than we'd like to believe. Now, whatever the actual existence of time is it simply the passage of the seasons? Does it have a real physical identity to it? That's something we can definitely debate. And there's even the argument that there are multiple overlapping timelines, or that time itself doesn't even exist. It's simply a perspective that we have, and that we share to try to achieve some sort of shared understanding. Now, other people say, well, we age, there's demonstrable signs of the passage of time, and while this may be true, there are other accounts that show that perhaps time's not as fixed as we like to think. Even going back to the legend of how Merlin aged in reverse, and he was able to foretell prophecy because he had already witnessed such events. Now, while these may seem like extreme accounts, these are all the details that we have to take into consideration when we're trying to understand the legacy of the ant people. The disturbing revelation of the fact that these may have been benign beings, but they also may have been tormentors. It's possible that we just don't know what their true intention was. Maybe they simply wanted to exist and survive by factoring in a civilization in the underground. There has to be some reason why that theme is still so strong with us to this day. Now again, you can look at the mainstream society that we have and the ongoing stated threat of nuclear annihilation. It certainly makes it a sensible prospect to have a developed survival complex underground. Yet you can find other more modern films and forms of fiction that'll tell you that no matter how far underground you go, there might not be any survival. I'll reference the more recent 2000s film Knowing, where no matter how far you went underground, it wasn't going to save you from that particular calamity. But interesting to consider, the subterranean compounds with their nuances and their details. Some are extensive subterranean compounds where you could fit tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people within. And yet others are smaller dwellings, almost giving the impression that there really was this desire, this effort to establish this. And I'm under the mindset that it went a lot further than simply trying to evade some Roman authorities that were chasing them on horseback at the time. There's even the more recent discoveries that were informed, and I haven't been to this site specifically, that we're given the impression that this is evidence of ancient human existence. And yet it fascinates me that we overlook one of the more basic observational details with this image, that we see what appears to be some sort of hive compound. And so, is this giving some credence to the theory that the ant people really did exist? That there was some sort of advanced life form that resembled an insect, or really was an advanced insect itself? Because one thing we don't know is, what are the possibilities of life? We think we understand it. We have the mainstream account that evolution takes a very long period of time. It's over millions of years that evolution occurs, to where a fish can go to a tube, to a monkey, to a human being. That's what will be informed from the mainstream. But yet we have a lot of other evidence that indicates that there can be sudden, abrupt changes. Is it possible that there was a technological capacity in the much nearer past than we'd like to think that had the ability to abruptly change the very form of life itself? What exactly is the dividing line between divine and technological capability? And does that line become a lot more blurred when we're trying to understand it over a period of time from accounts from the past? Why is it that there are so many overlapping mentalities with the traditions of whether it's the Hopi or any other group of societies or civilizations that seem to have a more advanced technological component that goes beyond simply divine being? And is it Arthur C. Clarke's statement that any sufficiently advanced civilization or technology would seem like magic to a less advanced civilization or technology. That seems to be the overlap that we have when we're trying to reconcile all these differences that we have. Now, of course, you can embrace the mainstream account and accept the belief that, yes, we've answered all the questions, yes, there are no mysteries, and that even trying to look at things from the perspective of mystery is a colossal waste of time. But I don't think you'd be here if you really thought any of that was true and that this is a waste of time, because why is there such an effort to try to convince us that it's a waste of time? It's a waste of time, then simply let us waste our time, and what difference does it make to you? In fact, the efforts to try to convince us that we are wasting our time are interesting to me. Because ultimately, should we not have the freedom to decide how to expend our own time? Well, no, there are many people out there who tell us and believe that they think they know what's best for us. And these people aren't part of institutions, they're not even part of governments or any other interests that we might traditionally associate with trying to control people. They're merely individuals who think they know what's best for whatever reason. And you'll find them in your midst all the time. But I strongly suggest that if you have the opportunity to really explore the nuances and the details of these different societies, these different cultures, look at them on their own, and then step far enough back and look at the commonalities that you see between them. And don't just allow things such as geographical separation or even quantum separation to make you believe that there are differences within these civilizations and these societies in the way that they viewed things. Because when you factor out distance and time, you suddenly find that there are a lot more similarities than we like to think. We suddenly realize that this may all be the same account, just simply told from different perspectives. That there really is one unified series of events that transpired in the past, and that it really is possible for us to gain a greater understanding of what truly happened. That it goes beyond the limitations of belief and the hard science that some other expert has to share with us. Now, that's not to discount that study. It's not to say that there aren't details in it. I mean, I myself even think that there is something behind the concept of the fourth dimensional structure of our entire spatial existence. But I don't believe that's the end-all be-all answer. I think that it's something even in greater grandeur than we could even begin to understand. It's certain to say that I don't think that we can perceive it with sight alone, that there might be a lot of other nuances behind it. But that's just my personal belief. You are certainly welcome to your personal beliefs, and by all means, share them. But why is it when we look at the terrain in different places, we do see something of a monument to the past? Now, whether we want to classify that monument as something that was created by natural forces or artificial forces, well, perhaps you could even say that that delineation is irrelevant in and of itself, because we do see the remains of the past everywhere that we look. And I think that's one of the closest things we can say to an incontrovertible fact that there is. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage you that if you have the ability and the access, that you explore structures that are nearby to your physical location. Explore your local government buildings that seem to defy the understood capability of the civilization that constructed them at the time. Explore mounds. Explore things that were informed were created by indigenous peoples of the distant past. Compare and contrast them. Don't limit your understanding by saying, well, that couldn't have been so because someone else told me it couldn't have been so. Really entertain the possibility for a moment. See the connections and see if you can really extrapolate from those connections an idea of how our true history is. I believe that is one of the most important legacies that we can have. And do these ant people still exist? Do the Anunnaki still exist? Do the Tuatha De Danann still exist? Or do their descendants still exist? I think of the example from the science fiction TV show Babylon 5 from the 1990s, where it posited the existence of different civilizations at different times. There were the old ones, the original species that came about first, and then the newer, younger races that followed them. And the main theme of Babylon 5 was how these old ones, or these original races, tried to influence the younger races. They tried to encourage and create a divine theocracy, in some cases, if you will. The Shadows or the Vorlons. And you can certainly do your own research and watch the TV series and see how these themes are presented. And it's a very unique presentation. Now, another interesting little fact is that the other science fiction series at the time, Star Trek, specifically Star Trek The Next Generation, had their own concept of a progenitor species, or an older race called the Preservers, if you will. And there was an episode called The Chase in Star Trek The Next Generation that posited this entire existence. Now, granted, Babylon 5 was more of an ensemble show that had overarching plot threads that went about through the entire season, whereas Star Trek was viewed as something that was standalone. But the idea and the theme is exactly the same, where you have these older races, these older beings, and we think of these older races or older beings as perhaps those that survived resets, and maybe even found a way to which they could exist far longer than the limited period of time that we have. Now, whatever the duration of that time frame is, whether it's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of years, it's hard to say because we really don't know what came in the past. Now, maybe you want to embrace the concept of having that confidence that you know exactly what the chronology of the past is, and I understand that there's a comfort in that. It's very difficult to see things as being ambiguous or ambivalent, to not have answers, because we are conditioned to seek answers and to know exactly what the solution to every problem is. We find it in our main forms of mental exercise every single day. And we live currently in a civilization that reinforces us, gives us positive reinforcement to find those answers. It's much more difficult to exist where there are mysteries, where there is ambiguity. When you see drawings like this and you admit to yourself, I don't exactly know what they represent. And yes, certainly you can listen to the Hopi oral traditions and you can realize and think that, yes, it was simply the elaborate imagination of people in the past who couldn't explain how they survived some terrifying event, and therefore they used their imaginations to explain it, and they recorded these drawings. And these cultural traditions endured over a period of time. And yes, that's completely possible. But it's also possible that these references to these incredible beings do have a lot more rooted in reality than we like to think. That this really is referring to a more advanced civilization. That whether these ant people, or whatever other name that we have for them in other cultures, whether they were benign or whether they had terrifying intent, that if they did exist, and if they do exist, then it is evidence, it is an indicator that it is possible to live on a much longer timeline. To not just have a singular lifestyle, but also to have a mentality where your existence, the existence of your civilization, will endure. To where you could achieve feats of, how shall we say, physical and spiritual transcendence. And if you do watch Babylon 5 to its conclusion, you'll see that that does seem to be the fate to any life form that exists on a long enough period of time. That it continues to grow. And maybe evolve isn't exactly the proper word. Perhaps something else happens. Maybe we achieve some sort of awareness that we're supposed to achieve. That instead of just achieving balance with our natural environment, we're actually able to achieve some sort of transcendence, some sort of transformation. And that's how we actually explain this concept that we have of our existence here. Perhaps that's the true purpose of life. That we're to face these trials and tribulations, and we're to gain this internal insight, this introspection. Because you'll find that virtually every mechanism that we have in our current civilization, right, wrong, or indifferent, it seems to function to keep us from engaging in this introspection, from looking within and trying to achieve this greater understanding. I think that's perhaps one of the greatest examples that we have of the possibility of the existence of the ant people. Now, were they saviors or were they tormentors? And if they do still exist, is it possible that they are influencing our current civilization? Because again, taking the example of the TV series Babylon 5, we found that these older races did have very, how shall we say, difficult means of influencing the younger races to do their bidding, to act in their own interest. And is that the reason why we have all these interesting cycles that we observe? Or is it some other explanation entirely? I do not know the answers, and I'm willing to admit and exist in an area where I don't know the answers. And if you're someone out there who wants to criticize someone for not knowing answers, then be my guest. If you already know everything, then what are you even doing here? Why are you even asking these questions? Well, I suppose only you can answer that. But what I'll leave you with on this very interesting and unique exploration is that you do have to seek your own answers. No one can do it for you, and maybe you find it easier to accept the answers that others have sought, and if you do, I'm happy for you, and I hope you find comfort and solace in doing that. But for others, there is something to be said for seeking your own answers, for constantly looking and constantly exploring all these unique mysteries that we have. I myself am both terrified and reassured that there are still many mysteries in our reality, that we have not yet explained everything. And I believe that is one of the fundamental functions of our existence here. And it doesn't really matter in that respect whether this is a reality, a simulation, or everything in between. We ultimately have to find our own answers, and maybe you believe that others have found those answers for you. Maybe you believe that the divine answers are found in Revelations, and maybe they are correct. Ultimately, I leave it to you. And I am open to all different forms and explanations, because I think only by considering all of them will we find the answers that we seek. But what are your thoughts? What do you think is the reality behind the ant people? Did they really exist? Are they simply the product of a legend? Are they divine beings? Are they actually humans that had some sort of advanced technology? Or are they something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.